Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another round of the online Peace Science Colloquium. So I am Chelsea Estancona. I'm an associate professor at the University of South Carolina, and I'm one of the two co-organizers of the OPSC, myself and Andres Gannen, who is at Vanderbilt University. And so the OPSC began in 2015, so we're going on 10 years now. And this was designed to sort of stretch the annual meeting of the Peace Science Society to give us opportunities to connect with one another over research at times other than just the annual meeting itself. So we want to celebrate the excellent research that happens towards a wider audience, as well as to just kind of continue the tradition of great academic discussion in peace science itself. So you can find us on the Peace Science website, which is hosted by UNT. And we do also still have, I believe, a Twitter or an X as well. So you can seek us out that way. So we have a fantastic paper today, and it's entitled The Democracy Exception, Uneven IOQ Following in Global Governance. And this is brought to us by Clara Suong, who is an assistant professor at Virginia Tech. And I believe there's some co-authors on the paper, so she'll be presenting for us in a moment. Uh, we then have two wonderful discussants. We have Christoph Mikulasche, and he is an assistant professor at Harvard University. And then we have Gabriella Levy, who is an assistant professor at the University of Washington. So I'll remind you all of some basics of participation. So attendees, if you're popping in, you're invited to leave comments or questions in the chat. If there's time, I will bring those to the forefront as perhaps not as Clara is talking, but certainly as the discussing proceeds. But we will focus first on discussant comments to enable Clara to get great feedback on her paper. All right, so we'll go ahead and we will proceed directly to Clara's presentation, which should be about 15 minutes.
Great. Thank you so much for the great introduction, Chelsea, and thank you. Hello there, audience. So let me just share my slide. Go. You see the slides? Um, so hi everyone. My name is Claire Song, and thanks so much to the organizers and to the discussants for letting me present this co-authored paper. So this is a paper co-authored with Scott Desposato and Eric Gartsky at UCSD. And the paper's title is The Democracy Exception, Uneven IOQ Following in Global Governance. Um, so, as you know, many resolutions or many policy proposals at the UN often fail before eventually passing. And there are also resolutions that actually pass and then fail or fail to be renewed. And so, in other words, when we talk about signals, policy proposals, or policy cues from international organizations, the public, the global public, often gets multiple cues from the same international organization over the same issue. So this paper basically started out as an effort to answer this question about the effect of multiple cues, multiple policy cues from one international organizations, and how the public basically reacts to different cues from the organization, from the international organizations. And we basically focus on consistency, the consistent reactions to these multiple cues from international organization. And basically, we are interested in figuring out whether individuals stay basically loyal to IOQs across different contexts surrounding a policy issue. And there have been a lot of innovative studies about how IOQs basically can persuade the public, and how endorsement of certain policies by international organizations basically can or cannot persuade the public to basically align with them. But consistency has yet to be examined. So the literature, basically, there's a well-developed literature that basically um, offers us many explanations about why these policy cues from international organizations may be persuasive to the public. And scholars have offered normative explanations, and informational explanations and social explanations. So scholars have highlighted how these IOQs um, basically serve as norms that individuals are signaled or pressured or feel like they should follow. Often, IO policy endorsements can also serve as important information signal that basically serve as a second opinion that individuals can use to basically check the quality of the policies basically enacted by their own government, right? So strategic signals. And recent literature also has highlighted how IEO policy cues serve as social signals, that it's a basically signal from an in group to members of another in group, such as kind of like the liberal democratic community. But again, um, consistency or consistent reactions to multiple cues among the public has not been examined. And um, there is some there are some just suggestions, or there are some implications from recent findings about the consistency, however. So, for example, recent literature has documented how international organizations or cues from international IOs actually may wield only weak influence over the public and can even backfire. Other recent literature also highlights that it actually may be the political context, especially the policy content that the international organizations either endorse or oppose that may matter more in determining consistency. Um, so our theory, first, is that there are basically two possibilities, right? So it is possible for individuals to be quite consistent in aligning themselves with international organizations. And the literature basically suggests two reasons that this may happen. So the literature has documented that this endorsement effect of IOQs does result in a big kind of increase of support for the policies endorsed by international organizations. So the magnitude of the kind of the main effects basically perhaps implies that individuals are likely to stay loyal to international organizations' cues no matter what. The second reason is that individuals also, in general, tend to be very reliant on external cues over political issues in general. So, for example, individuals tend to be reliant on partisan cues, right? What their own in partisan elites say about policies and just follow them, right? Um, so this basically brings us to the first hypothesis that individuals may be consistent toward international organizations' cues. The second possibility is that individuals may be actually inconsistent in following international organization cues because first, their loyalty basically may vary by political context. And the second reason is that maybe some individuals have strong policy preferences, strong underlying foreign policy orientations that actually determine their policy stance rather than whether the policy is endorsed by international organizations. For example, it may be that it may matter which country that the IOQ is basically target, right? Is the policy about potential adverse action that targets a democratic country or a non-democratic country, right? So the Q target may determine basically the inconsistency. Individuals may be also be willing to abandon international organization cues because of which country the Q they are in, basically which home country they are in, right? So it may matter that whether they're in a democratic or non-democratic country, because that basically their perceived their trust in domestic political institutions may basically still spill over um, to how they basically see international organizations and how whether they should follow international organization cues. The third reason is that there actually may be democratic solidarity, right? So it actually may matter what sort of political context that the Q receiver, that individuals and the Q target share, rather than, and this may be more important to individuals rather than, simple loyalty to international cues. Um, and other basically political attributes of individuals and their foreign policy preferences may also make them actually inconsistent in following international cues, international organization cues. So for example, individuals with strong isolationism may be unwilling to follow international organization cues because they have strong preference about non-engagement in international politics. It also may be that individuals who strongly believe in cooperative internationalism actually may see value in following international organization cues itself. They see that as something of more value, um, and it also could be that individuals may be inconsistent in following international organizations because they strongly believe in the importance of military action as an important political tool. So that may make them inconsistent and not very loyal in following international organization cues. So basically, this basically brings us to the alternative hypothesis that individuals in general may be inconsistent in following international organization cues. So basically, we tackled this problem with a little bit uncommon research design. So we basically implemented a within design survey experiment where each individual was exposed to two treatments. One in each individual was exposed to basically an UNQ that basically did not approve use of force, and each that individual was exposed to the opposite, basically Q, in which the UN basically approved the U.S. Use of force, right? So basically, and then after each vignette, each individual was asked this question, the outcome question: should country A attack and use force to resolve the situation? And this is a vignette. So basically, we can, this basically design produces four categories of responses. This individual is basically what we call a consistent individual because the policy stance that this individual that basically chose aligned with the UN perfectly, right? Regardless of whether the UN approved use of force or did not approve use of force. So this individual agreed with the UN both times basically. And again, this individual was also agreed with the UN, but the sequence, the order of the treatments basically was the opposite of the order of the treatment of the first individual. And in both the third respondent and the fourth respondent basically are examples of inconsistent responses because they basically disagree with the UN at least once. And in this case, the respondent basically disagreed with the UN when the UN basically was not endorsing use of force, right? And he still agreed. He still supported the use of force, whereas fourth respondent basically did the opposite, right? So the fourth respondent did not support the use of force, although the UN basically approved it. And we basically chose four countries that have geographic, geopolitical, and economic, and political and historical diversity. So we fielded the survey experiment in China, Brazil, Japan, and Sweden. And basically, we found that a lot of individuals were quite inconsistent. And we saw this pattern across four countries. So about 75% of all individuals were inconsistent with the UN, disagreeing with the UN at least once. And basically, like we hypothesized, we found three different sources of inconsistency. So one is the democratic solidarity. So when the UN's endorsement or opposition to policies basically violated democratic norms by targeting a democratic country before a democratic country, then the individuals in the democratic country basically abandoned UN cues and basically disagreed with the UN. And so you could see that so these countries represent the predicted probability of being inconsistent, basically, for democracies. And you can see for non-democratic country, the regime type of the Q target didn't really matter. But for individuals in democratic countries, like Brazil, Japan, and Sweden, it did really matter whether the Q target was a democratic country or not. Yeah. And the second, basic, and third sources of inconsistency were foreign policy beliefs, especially strong isolationism and weak cooperative internationalism of individuals. So individuals who believed in isolationism were much more likely to abandon UN cues and disagree with the UN. And people with weak cooperative internationalism were also more likely to be inconsistent towards UN cues. Okay, so basic takeaways. We do find a significant inconsistency in individuals' reactions to IOQs. And it was a lot more individuals than we expected. And again, we kind of come back to this importance of democratic norms because it is individuals are markedly inconsistent when UN cues or when IO cues actually violate democratic norms. So in other words, their democratic solidarity basically is what or the democratic quality of UN cues is is what what drives individuals' consideration and loyalty to UN cues, basically. Yeah. Um, Individuals' political attributes also can drive their inconsistency. And we believe that our results also has implications for the liberal international order because, again, as other scholars have documented, eh, the liberal international order's values and persuasiveness is rooted in its democratic values. Okay, so that's it. And I look forward to getting your questions and getting your feedback. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Clara. Yes, we can do either applause emojis or just now we'll go ahead and proceed into Christoph's comments.
Thank you, Chelsea. Well, I would like to offer 5 comments, but not before I praise the contribution of the study. This is the first paper to examine whether individuals respond consistently to different cues from the same IO, and I think that makes a big contribution to the literature. More generally, I think this is a promising avenue for research on how IOs shape public attitudes, and it really very nicely complements previous work, which has focused on heterogeneous effects of IO cues between individuals, between issues, between institutions, but hasn't theorized about variation within individuals. So clearly, you are adding a lot here. This leads me to my first and most important comment. I wonder whether the authorization of the use of force by the UN is the best context to study this topic. The reason is that the UN has never authorized the use of force against a democracy, nor has it come close, nor, at least in my opinion, is it plausible that it will in the foreseeable future, nor have NATO or other prominent IOs authorized the use of force against the democracy. And this raises questions about the external validity of your results, but also about the motivation for the argument. To be clear, the results and the theoretical logic that explains them are persuasive, but I think the study could better explain what these results tell us about a world where the UN just doesn't authorize the use of force against democracies. So I have 2 suggestions on how to move forward here. One would be, you could argue that public's anticipated reactions to a potential authorization of the use of force against the democracy by the UN are what makes this an off the equilibrium path outcome for the UN. So in a way, the fact that we don't see this in the real world might be construed as an observable implication of your argument. I'm not sure I buy the argument, but it's something you could consider. An alternative that I find a bit more plausible would be to consider how your argument on democratic and autocratic targets of IO intervention travels to other issue areas and beyond the use of force in the UN context. So for instance, would you expect to see similar effects if the IMF endorses an economic policy reform plan of a democratic or an autocratic government? Would you expect to see a similar outcome if the Human Rights Council of the UN or the UN High Commissioner for Refugees praises or criticizes a democracy or an autocracy for human rights infractions? And so you could offer some speculative answer and some conjectures in this paper. And if you do have the resources and the time, you might be able to run another round of the survey where you can show how your argument travels beyond the UN and the use of force, which would help demonstrate the broader explanatory power of the argument, even in a world where the UN just doesn't authorize the use of force against democracies. Now, second, there is a slight gap between the empirics and the frame. And at the start of the talk and in the paper, you speak of evolving cues and shifting cues that mimic real-world IOs that update their policy stances over time. But the survey doesn't seem to present it to experiments as instances where an IO changes its position. But if I understood the instrument correctly, it portrays them as 2 distinct hypotheticals. The analysis of the Q alignment crystallization in the appendix seems to get at the effect of evolving Qs, but since this isn't mentioned in the main text at all, it kind of gets buried at the very end of a very comprehensive appendix. So in a way, I think you should close that gap either by talking more about updating in the theory and empirics in the main text, or maybe by narrowing down the framing of it. I want to offer one suggestion for an avenue for future research before I turn to the empirics. I think a logical follow-up would be to investigate how inconsistency in IO signaling effects shapes the perceptions of the IO itself, right? I think that would be a neat extension of this line of research. Now, second, I want to move to the empirics, and I have two comments here. Well, the result for the effect of the interaction between the IO target and the Q receiver is essentially that the effect has a different effect in China than it does in the other three countries, which are all democracies. And well, there might arguably be other reasons why Chinese citizens respond differently to a UN authorization of war against a democracy than citizens of other countries. For instance, trust in the UN is 26 percentage points higher in China than it is on average in these other three countries, according to a recent multi-country survey. And that may explain why inconsistency in responses to UN cues is lower in China than it is in the other three countries. And obviously there's many other reasons in which China is different from the other three countries. And I was wondering how you can disentangle these potential differences to convince the readers that this is really about political regime type as opposed to any number of other differences between China and the other three countries in sample. My last comment is the authors deserve a lot of credit for the high level of research transparency. The paper is really a paragon of clarity in terms of how the methods are presented. And the appendix is great. I think the information in the appendix could be weaved a bit more effectively into the main text. For instance, by adding a robustness and sensitivity section. In short, you want to very succinctly summarize all the materials in the abstract in the main text. So for instance, at one point, the main text mentions that you ran 15 regression models, but we don't learn why and which ones. Just mention all this stuff in the main text. More information about the survey would also be useful. When exactly was the survey fielded? Exactly which survey companies did you work with in each country? And what kind of post-hoc survey weights did you use and why? Sample size varies a lot between the countries. I understand that the experiments were included in omnibus surveys, which and the different surveys may have had different budget constraints, and that may explain why the Chinese sample has 6 times more respondents than the Japanese samples. But give us a bit more information about all that. And last but not least, I think that the main models should include post-stratification weights. You do have the model specification with the weights in the appendix, but I would actually suggest that you make that your main specification. I will end here. Thank you so much. It was a pleasure reading it. I learned so much from it. This is wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Christoph. Go ahead, Gabriella.
All right. So Clara, thanks so much for the opportunity to read this. It's an interesting and rich paper. I especially appreciate your choice to run the survey across different contexts, which I know is expensive and difficult. I also think the combination of within and between subjects design is really interesting and something that I sort of haven't encountered as frequently as maybe I should have. So I have sort of a few theoretical comments and then a few empirical comments. So when reading this, and I think this was a bit clear in your presentation, I was very confused throughout the whole theory section about what inconsistency was. That wasn't really clear to me until figure 2 on page 26, which is very far into the paper. And maybe this is because I am not sort of embedded in this literature on like cues, but I struggled throughout the theory section. But I think that the fact that I struggled reflect is not only a writing issue. It doesn't seem to me like consistency with UNQs is the only quantity of interest. When you say that someone is consistent, to me, I think about consistency of policy preferences, right? So, which is a very different concept. You would call that inconsistency. But I think that a lot of your results can be understood or sort of enriched by disaggregating your analyses to look separately at people who say always attack and people who say always don't attack, right? So both sets of respondents are what you might call Q inconsistent, but they're fundamentally very different kinds of people, both of whom are consistent in their policy preferences or in their sort of interventionist preferences. And if you incorporate this distinction between two kinds of inconsistent respondents, then I think some of your hypotheses become tautological. You have sort of these arguments about militant internationalism and isolation, but of course, isolationists are Q inconsistent. They always prefer not to intervene. Like that's sort of definitional. And of course, militant internationalists are Q inconsistent. They always prefer to intervene, right? Like these, to me, these don't seem like hypotheses as much as sort of facts. And maybe they're not tautological, but I think it's worth justifying sort of why that's the case. And then I have a few design comments. So first, I want to sort of press you on your vignette and outcome variables. To me, the vignette reads very clearly like a run, although it might read differently to people in other contexts. And Christoph mentioned this, but I don't think it would make sense to call the target country a democracy. Like I don't know how people would interpret that. And I think it's worth discussing sort of you might disagree with those, but I think it's an important component to have a discussion of how people's different priors or different interpretations might shape the results. I also was a bit confused by your DV. Specifically, and I know that this is like a very survey person nitpicky thing, but your use of the word still only makes sense if someone wanted to attack in the first place. So you phrase the question like, would you still attack if? But like, if someone said that they don't want to attack and then they're asked if the country should still attack, I don't know how to interpret that. A few sort of appendix things. I know you don't sort of claim that your samples are nationally representative, but a comparison of your demographics to national demographics in the appendix would be helpful. And I think that's especially important if you weight, right? So if you're weighting, you are making the argument that this is when weighted nationally representative. And like, maybe that's possible, maybe that isn't. In the context where I work in Latin America, you really can't wait to make things nationally representative. It's just not possible given rates of sort of internet penetration in rural areas. I also didn't see details about the weights anywhere, like how did you construct them based on what variables? And Christoph mentioned this as well, but none of the robustness tests were sort of mentioned in the appendix. I mean, none of the appendix tests were mentioned in the main manuscript. And that's a super easy fix. Like you did all this work, tell the reader that you've done it and how it helps us understand the argument in your findings. So yeah, that's all from me. Thanks so much.
Okay. So I'd like to give Clara a chance to respond and to maybe ask for any additional either clarifications or to sort of get some discussion going between the two discussants about the exact ways you want to move forward.
Yeah, thanks so much for your comments. These are really helpful. And thanks so much for reading the paper closely too. Yeah, it's really helpful, I mean, I'm sure everyone here has experienced it, but it's really great to have like a second set of eyes, catch the mistakes and stuff like that. Yeah, yeah. So I guess I'll probably maybe respond to Gabriella first, in the reverse order. Yeah. So robustness checks, yes, I should definitely discuss it more in the main text. And in the, I think for the outcome question, see, I'm just trying to recall the exact wording of the outcome question, but basically we included in the, like a second iteration, uh, um, let's see. Yeah, so sorry. I think there was a little typo in the appendix, but so people got the question itself in the second iteration, the outcome question in the second iteration, basically reflected whether it reflected uh, their previous response to the outcome question in the first iteration. So like it wasn't like we basically forced everyone to assume that they actually supported the attack. So like for example, like if if a respondent basically answered in the first iteration that uh, they don't support the attack, then the outcome question, the second iteration basically asked, well, if the UN basically changed their stance, would you still go with your first response or would you update it? So basically, that was how the second question was framed, or it was phrased. So it basically reflected how they responded in the first iteration. So hopefully, that 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 makes it clear that we didn't like impose another like dimension on the respondents. So I guess yeah, thanks for your suggestion about kind of disaggregating consistency. I guess even so, I think the second measure of consistency, which we call Q alignment non-crystallization in the appendix, which is mouthful. I think that's we kind of try to do that because in that measure, an individual is basically classified as consistent only if they support the policy that the UN supports. Whereas I think in the main text, our consistent measure was a little more broad, basically. So, and we basically got like the same main results as the main text. So both measures of consistency or regression analysis of both measures of consistency basically resulted in very similar results. And I guess even if we disaggregate individuals' consistency by like their policy or by their like a policy stance, I think we probably can still make an argument that our measure is a little more behavioral, right? Because I think the questions about foreign policy beliefs, questions about isolationism, internationalism, are basically generic questions. So, like, do you believe in this? Do you believe or that? Right? Whereas we actually in this experiment we actually observe whether individuals basically side with the UN or not. So hopefully we're getting something a little more than just asking directly what they believe in. But I definitely take your point about how maybe this can be resolved by actually discussing the second measure of consistency in the main text and clarifying it too. Yeah. And I get your point about, I think it could be a little bit confusing about, I think, consistency, because I think our paper does focus on consistency with regard to like the cues rather than the policy. Yeah. So I think for this version basically has the definition of consistency in a footnote, but again, maybe I should upgrade it to the main text. Yeah. And Christoph, thanks again so much for the comments. I guess Gabriella and Christoph both mentioned how I should probably discuss like the weights in the main text too. Yeah, but these so we unfortunately were not able to basically hire YouGov for all 4 countries because they were quite expensive. So as you know, if YouGov does actually provide like weights. But at the same time we wanted to create weights for all 4 countries. So we ended up not using the YouGov weights. But it was basically the weights were just simply created by raking by the tabulation of the population by demographic groups. So but I should again discuss it in the main text. But it's not well, for now our weights are quite simple, and we should probably consider more sophisticated versions of weights, because I think that's something that we haven't really tackled. And let's see. I guess regarding why Chinese citizens react differently. Yeah, so I'm hoping this may not be a perfect answer, but I'm hoping that randomization, at least among the Chinese citizens, may take care of this a little bit, because I think even again, I know we're basically comparing citizens in China versus citizens in other countries, and of course citizens are not randomly assigned to their countries, but at the same time I think the fact that there isn't, well, we actually ran some regressions just among the Chinese sample. I think we got results that are consistent with the main results, if I remember correctly. So I'm hoping that it's not only about China versus citizens of other countries, but maybe just among, when we look at kind of within sample variation, there we don't really see any like sensitivity to the regime type of the Q target. So hopefully we are getting something that's not only about higher popularity of UN in China. And again, of course, it's not perfect, but yeah, but I think like across national differences also is something that I think other researchers could definitely explore, because we also see an interesting pattern even just among democracies. So you'll see that like in Japan, there are a lot more people are actually inconsistent, and we and I've been kind of looking at this. I've been trying to revise the paper, and I think we should probably mention like the interesting patterns like among Chinese and Japanese citizens. Probably, leaving it to future researchers, but it's yeah, it's an interesting pattern. Yeah, and let's see. Oh yeah, so gap between the start of the paper. Yeah, so I guess I should try to narrow it down. And you're right. I think honestly, it has been a little bit challenging because we don't really have a representative, like we didn't really have a representative example. We didn't have a example that would like work as a very nice hook, so to speak, because I think the UN does tend to act against act against non-democratic countries, and usually the especially the use of force and its authorization are spearheaded by democracies. Yeah, but at the same time, I think we probably in the next revision we're probably going to try to kind of highlight this coincidence, right? Because so it seems like if what we observe is all instances of democratic countries and the UN acting against non-democratic countries, but there's really no good way to actually, test whether this is really meaningful, right? There's really no, causal identification, but we do see like this kind of like a democracy versus non-democracy coinciding with like the UN authorization of force. So hopefully we can revise the introduction a little bit more so that that's why we need an experiment because we need to tease the two apart. Um, so I mean, I think your feedback, your comments on this point definitely give me like food for thought. Though. But I think it's just observationally, it is an interesting pattern. Yeah, and yeah. So regarding like whether this travels to other issues, now that's a question I'm also I guess I can speculate, but really am not that confident about. Yeah. But I think at the same time, I think I was a little bit surprised about this kind of democratic solidarity pattern. Yeah. I think a lot of scholars, including myself, will kind of had gotten a little tired of like the democratic piece and how regime types are important. But at the same time, I mean, seems like it does matter. Yeah, yeah. Okay, well, I'll stop here. Yeah, and thanks for your comments.
Okay, fantastic. So either Christoph or Gabriella, is there anything that you wanted to either expand on or a more minor point that you, I suppose, didn't have quite the time to discuss earlier? If you do, now would be a great time if you'd like to share anything else.
I think I'm good.
I can send you some comments by email.
Okay. Yeah, Clara, so I didn't read the paper, I will say, as thoroughly as our two discussants did because they did such a fantastic job. But something that stuck out to me, which I think kind of mirrors some of the two discussants' comments, is that throughout I'm thinking about a huge variety of possible IO cues, right? And so you've got some examples in the intro, and we've already talked about kind of the gap there that are related to, the use of force. And then, of course, your experimental test is that direct vignette. But throughout, you use very general language, I think, about like what is an IOQ and like what does it mean for, for people to be inconsistent in their perception of those cues. And so I do think that either it would be wise to sort of narrow the scope in your discussion of just how you kind of talk through this, or to take Christoph's suggestion of, really considering where else this might apply. And is this really kind of a story about cues directly related to the use of force or, cues more broadly? I see that as sort of a framing issue, not a, redo the paper issue. So. Okay. That is all of the thoughts that I had. And so I think that I'm not seeing any comments from the audience. And so unless anyone has anything else that they would like to say, I think we're pretty much ready to wrap up. But I will once again just say a huge thank you to each of you for taking time again out of what I know is a very busy time. I'm sure you all are in, the thick of your semesters. And so, Clara, thank you for giving us a great paper. Christoph and Gabriella, thank you very much for taking the time to read and give such thorough and thoughtful discussant comments. So this, excuse me, this video will be available straight through on our YouTube page. So Clara, if you want to go back through and sort of look over this, and then similarly, we do encourage people who may be watching this to also leave comments on that YouTube page or to email Clara directly if you have some thoughts on the paper as you move forward. So I think that we will wrap things up there. Thanks very much to each of you.